All right, I think we can get started. Making this call out of Trenton today, and the road traffic is particularly loud, so hopefully that doesn't bleed into the mic too bad for you folks. You'll notice in the chat that Aiden just dropped in a call-in number if anybody doesn't have audio on their computer and needs to access this. Also, further up in the chat is a link to the Natural Working Land Strategy webpage. We're going to refer to that several times today. Good afternoon. I'm Heather Genovich, and I'm in the Division of Science and Research at New Jersey DEP. I've had the pleasure of working with some of the state's finest from across the departments of environmental protection and agriculture in developing this natural and working land strategy. This is the third of 4 stakeholder meetings on the strategy. So far, we've covered wetlands and aquatic habitats, as well as developed land. This coming Tuesday, we're going to talk about forests, and today we're here to talk about agriculture. We're going to go over our targets or goals, and we're looking for feedback from you folks because you work closely in these fields every day. The primary purpose of this strategy is to maximize carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. When I first started working on this project, that term working lands was kind of foreign to me. For anybody else who isn't really familiar with it, it refers to farms or forests or other such lands from which we get any products. So in the strategy, we'll lay out specific actions that can maximize sequestration on public lands, and there will be some opportunities for private lands as well. So before we really dig in, I want to let everybody know this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on our website along with the presentation materials. Some of the folks that have registered today include farmers, conservation groups, environmental consultants, government agencies, universities, and more. And we're really pleased to have folks from all these different sectors here to help guide the strategy. So first, we're going to go over some ground rules. We are using the webinar format in Teams, which means that attendee microphones and cameras are off by default. You can provide comments or ask questions in the chat at any time, but we ask that you limit discussion to the topics that we are covering today. There will be a time for you to raise your hand and ask questions verbally at the end of Rachel's talk, and I'll call on people one at a time and temporarily allow microphone privileges. Once I do that, you have to turn your own mic on as well, so I'll probably remind you at that time. Now, our main purpose for being here today is to share the progress we've made on the strategy and to hear from you. We will consider every bit of input that we receive, but we're not going to issue a response document. After these 4 meetings, we're going to take back your comments, integrate them where appropriate, and we'll continue writing the strategy. We're looking to release it later this year, most likely towards the end of the 3rd quarter. If you find that you have additional comments after the meeting, there is a comment form on our website. It's the same link at the bottom of this slide. I'm going to throw that up about 30 times in the presentation, but you can give us any questions or comments through that form at any time. And any time is a false advertisement. We do want comments before April 14th. So again, my name is Heather Genovich. After me, Tony Rowe is going to discuss the impetus for the strategy and how it fits in with DEP's climate initiatives. Mattia Jepsen is going to give an overview of what is in the strategy and how we developed our targets. Mattia will be followed by Rachel DeFlumeri from the Department of Ag, who will go over the targets for agriculture. And you can type comments or questions in at any time, but we'll call on raised hands after Rachel is finished. After that, I'll wrap up the meeting with a focus on what's next, how you can review the targets, and where to go to submit comments online. Now I'm going to pass the mic to Tony Rowe.
Thanks, Heather. Hello, everyone. My name's Tony Rowe. I work for the DEP Bureau of Climate Change, and I'm going to talk about the background of how all this got started. So the state's climate action is guided by 3 major greenhouse gas reduction goals, and it's governed by the Global Warming Response Act and the Executive Order 274 from the Murphy administration, which calls New Jersey to do the following. 1, there's a little bit of a lag here. Sorry, there we go. 1 is to reduce the statewide greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels, that's the year 1990, that's approximately 112 million metric tons of CO2 by the year 2020 and further. That's been already accomplished, so that's a great thing for the state. The second goal is to reduce the statewide greenhouse gas emissions by 50% below 2006 levels. And that's approximately 60.4 million metric tons of CO2 by the year 2030. That's on our to-do list. And our last and third major goal is to reduce the emissions by 80% below the 2006 level mark. That's an additional 24.2 million metric tons of CO2 by the year 2050. That's another major thing that we are working on right now. Now, even if we did all that, meeting these ambitious goals by reducing 50% by 2030, an additional 80% by 2050, it's going to require an economy-wide transformation that demands all economic sectors, levels of government, companies, communities, individuals, everyone, to make some fundamental changes in how we consume energy, produce waste, and interact with our natural lands. So in 2020, DEP released a report. It's called the Global Warming Response Act 80/50 report. And in it, number one, it identifies the specific pathways to achieve the 80/50 reduction goal. Two, evaluates 7 emission sectors of New Jersey's economy and models how the state can achieve reductions in those sectors. And the third major component to that report, it provides specific policy recommendations for actionable plans. So within the report, this is the summary of it. The report lays out 4 major pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The first is replacing fossil fuel vehicles and electric vehicles with electric vehicles. The second one is converting space and water heating in the residential and commercial building sectors to electric heating. And third, replacing fossil fuels in the electric power generation sector with renewable sources. However, even if we achieve all 3 of these major transitions, New Jersey will not reach its greenhouse gas reduction goals without significant protection of our natural working lands. That's what we're talking about it today. And carbon sequestration is needed to offset our gross emissions. So in addition to that report, Jersey DEP released a series of other reports and plans that identifies and addresses the impacts of climate change. Now there's 6 of these reports in total, but a common thread is the role of the state's natural working lands that addresses climate change. So just to give some basic summary of all these reports, the 2020 Science Report on Climate Change, it identifies impacts to natural lands from the changing climate. The 2020 Global Warming Response Act report identifies a role that carbon sequestration will play in achieving out those reduction goals. The 2020 RGGI Strategic Funding Plan identifies a steady funding stream to enhance the state's natural working lands. The 2021 Climate Resilience Strategy report identifies a role of nature-based solutions to support resiliency goals. And then the New Jersey Wetlands Program and the Forest Action Plans, they both evaluate the role that lands provide in protecting carbon sequestration. Now, the focus of today and the focus of the report that's at the center is a natural working land strategy, which furthers strengthens all these efforts from all these reports, and it strengthens the state's commitment to protecting and enhancing the carbon pools of its natural lands through the adoption of carbon sequestration targets by land types and by identifying actionable management practices. The strategy will in turn be utilized as a feedback loop to inform future iterations of all these plans and the development of incentive programs and regulatory policies. Then I'm going to turn this over to Mattia.
Thanks, Tony. Right, gonna take control. Oh, I think what did I do, Heather?
Still seeing the slides. Do you still have a
You are?
take control option?
No, I did take control and now it's not showing the slides to me, but you guys are seeing the slides?
We are.
Okay, oh, here we go. It came back. Great. So my name is Mattia Jepsen. I am a bureau chief and wetland scientist in the Division of Science and Research at the New Jersey DEP. And first I wanted to start with some carbon sequestration basics. So plants take carbon dioxide out of the air as part of photosynthesis, and the carbon is stored in their leaves and roots. As the leaves and other parts of the plants die, they get incorporated into the soil. The living and dead plant material, fungus that's in the soil, and microbial biomass are all considered to be sequestered carbon. Some stored carbon is re-released into the atmosphere when plants and soil microbes respire. It can be either released as carbon dioxide, methane, or as other gases. When natural and working lands are disturbed, there can be an increase in the readmission of carbon. So an increase in taking the carbon that's stored in the soil and putting it back into the atmosphere as greenhouse warming gases. And if you disturb the plants, you can have a decrease in the amount of carbon that's stored and the rate of storage. Land management strategies can be used to protect stored carbon and increase the rate of carbon storage. So the natural and working lands, for this plan, we are looking at several different habitat types. We have forests, agriculture, wetlands, developed lands, and aquatic habitats. And so today we are looking into agriculture. The other topics were either were covered over the last 2 webinars or will be covered in the final webinar, which is next Tuesday. In order to help jumpstart land management practices that will increase carbon sequestration, the department has been working collaboratively with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture for the past 2 years to draft an evolving natural and working land strategy that identifies detailed actions that can mitigate the impact of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration. The strategy includes specific land management practices, describes program development and policies that could be implemented by state agencies to protect stored carbon and increase carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural working lands. In this way, the state will be in a better position to meet the 80 by 50 emissions targets that Tony discussed. The recommendations in the natural and working land strategy are expected to be broadly applicable to other groups that manage land as well. Thus, landowners and managers, nonprofits, universities, and policymakers from all jurisdictions are also key audiences for the strategy. We kicked off the development of the natural and working land strategy in May of 2021 and released a scoping document later that year that basically laid out what we were trying to do and how we plan to go about it. We collected comments at that time and also requested any reports or literature that we should be taking a look at. So we received that and compiled it. And then we developed work groups within the New Jersey Department of Agriculture and the DEP for each one of the land types. And we began to develop recommendations and targets, which I'll go into a little bit more in a minute. So now we are at the stakeholdering of those recommendations and targets. We are wrapping up our stakeholdering next week. There is some additional time for people to provide comments, as Heather mentioned, on the website. And then we will be writing the plan in earnest. So we'll basically be taking the recommendation list that's available on the website now and just adding the text and context around it. And then we hope to release the final strategy towards the end of 2023. So in terms of how the strategy has been developed, how these recommendations and targets were selected, first we took a look at other documents that were like what we wanted the natural and working land strategy to look like. There are many states that have natural and working land strategies that are related to carbon sequestration. The federal government has put out some great recommendations. Other countries have recommendations. Nonprofits and NGOs have recommendations. So we compiled all of those reports and we pulled out from there all of the recommendations that other groups had made. Then with our expert habitat groups, they took a look at those lists and they honed them for New Jersey. They removed anything that would not be appropriate for New Jersey, either because we don't have those habitat types, or for one reason or another, they wouldn't work here. Once we had a more manageable list, the next thing we did was do some modeling of the carbon benefit of those activities. And when modeling wasn't available, we did literature searches because we wanted to make sure that there was some sound scientific underpinning for the recommendations that we selected. So any recommendation that was selected had to have a scientific underpinning that demonstrated that there would be a net carbon sequestration benefit of implementing those practices. We also looked at the cost of doing the practices and thought about that, and also the scalability. Is this something that we can do on one piece of land in the state, or is this something that we can do on 100,000 acres in the state? The work groups then, based on these three different factors, selected the recommendations and then thought about some more about those recommendations. So they developed fact sheets about the who, the what, the when, the where, the how, the why of each one of those recommendations. They documented impediments to achieving those recommendations. We thought about impacts to overburdened communities. We thought about how climate change might affect our ability to implement these actions. And we also thought about the other benefits to ecosystems and people that might be provided by doing these things, so the other ecosystem services. One of the other requirements for the recommendations was that they not degrade habitat or have really negative impacts on biodiversity. So we wanted to make sure that that yes, these practices sequester carbon, but that they also aren't negatively impacting the ecosystem or people. And then we set targets for 2030 and for 2050. And this is mostly for land management activities. So how many acres could we do this on by 2030 and by 2050? The 2030 and the 2050 align with the carbon sequestration and emissions targets that Tony mentioned earlier. And now I will turn it over to Heather.
Thanks, Mattia. So before we really dive into the list of targets for agriculture, these are the questions I want you to keep in the back of your mind. In particular, we want to know if there's anything missing from our draft list of targets. Now, please remember that any practices you suggest must have published scientific literature that confirms a net sequestration benefit. We also want to know if you see any targets that don't belong on these lists, and we want to hear why that is the case. To improve the chances of success in meeting these targets, we need to identify and address key obstacles to achieving the targets. What obstacles do you foresee? And we know that these changes will come at a cost. We'll need to pair financing mechanisms, and we want to hear about any potential sources of funding that you might be aware of. So now I'm going to hand it over to Rachel DeFlameri.
How's everybody doing today? I'm going to be presenting on some of the recommendations that we came up with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture. Just to start off, there's about 12% of the land mass in New Jersey is actually covered by agricultural land, so roughly about 543,000 acres. And agricultural lands can be carbon sources, but I think in improving the soil health, we can convert them over into the carbon sinks. Oops, I have to actually switch the slides. Sorry about that. Getting a little jittery. But and I want to keep in mind too that each farm is unique. It's diverse, so some of these recommendations can be used in tandem. Some of them won't work for others, and these are going to be very site. In agriculture is interesting is in that it's very site specific. It depends upon the management. It depends upon the soil type, the topography of the land, what the management strategy looks like. So these are just basic recommendations that I think could be implemented on a lot of our agricultural lands. And then to note, I was using the 2017 agricultural census data in order to come up with some of the target numbers that we're going to be seeing today. So again, since it's 2017, a lot of these numbers can be a little bit different, and we are seeing a shift in the amount of agricultural land that is still in production. And unfortunately, those numbers are actually in decline in most of the counties that are agriculturally productive. These strategies are meant to be used in tandem and collectively, or on their own, depending, like I said, depending upon the management strategy. And as Matea had already mentioned, the following recommendations were things that were verified. So a lot of research went into how many research papers were published on this, and cross-checking both of the resources all the resources that were available, and things that are actually practical to our state. As you know, New Jersey is a very, very diverse state. From the north, central, and south, we have very different regions of climatic conditions, soil types, and operations that are productively viable. And I also want to mention too, there is a lack of data that's actually available a lack of data on the producers that are already implementing some of these strategies. So that's one of the things that I really want to hit home with today, because there are a lot of producers that are already implementing a lot of these practice recommendations that I'll be speaking about today. So within the first recommendation is compost on cropland and on pasture land, and cropland pasture being cropland fallowed and used for cover crop for that season. Now, compost as a whole is a very, very diverse mixture, and it depends on your C to N ratio, on its ability to sequester the carbon, and as well as what it's going to provide for nutrient needs and soil health overall. There needs to be consideration given towards the timing of your applications, particularly for vegetable producers, where you don't want to be tying up any of the nitrogen in the soil, because that's going to affect your upcoming cropping season. Another consideration in the types of compost that it's hard to dictate into a practice target number is the amount of time that compost takes to cure. And that's going to denote how valuable it is for a carbon resource to be further stored and to actually feed the microbiome in the soil. The types of feedstocks that are also used are going to be considered within that. And again, compost is a very variable mixture. On to the next. One of the recommendations, which we don't have a lot of data on, but something that was interesting to me, particularly very much recently, when we're looking at our ash trees and our hedgerows and our field edges. And a lot of the spent feedstocks material that otherwise gets wasted can be further used to create biochar. Now, biochar is something that resists degradation. It also has a porous surface on the interior, so that's a great habitat for the microbiology that's existing in the soil. And without a microbiome, you're very limited on your capacity, if not any, to store the carbon materials within your soil. It's very resistant to degradation, so it lasts in the soil for a very long time. However, one thing to note is that there needs to be a charge provided by compost, because if you're just putting in biochar without having it be inoculated by a compost material, it actually ends up absorbing all the nutrients. Now, there are a lot of other added benefits to biochar too, and this is something that could be an economic benefit to a lot of our producers to sell for soil bioremediation, water remediation, and again, like I said, a great holding source for our soil nutrients. Further, it also increases your soil organic matter, which then will provide for better soil health, greater crop productivity. My next recommendation is cover crops. Again, this is a very varied recommendation. Now you could have cover crop mixtures, you could have standalone monocrop material that you're putting in, and a lot of it depends upon cover crop availability, where you're sourcing your seed materials, and the expense of applying a cover crop, because that's one of the factors that I would like to see actually looked at, would be how can we make this more economically viable? How can we put added value into planting these cover crops? Can they be grazed? Can we in turn also use like perennial grains as a source of cover cropping material? And the other portion of that too is you can utilize mixtures as well, and then your time for termination within the cover crop. Cover cropping also has a lot of nuances to it, and there's a very steep learning curve to the adoption of the cover crops, in that it's having the correct planting equipment, and then being able to terminate the cover crop in time to get your soil heated up, as well as being able to physically plant within the material itself. Another recommendation that I had is rotational grazing, and I will have a diagram of what that looks like for some of you that don't know. But again, this is a very practice, and can be dynamic in nature. Some of the cons to it are it does require a lot of space, so land acreage, and it depends upon your livestock type. For instance, I don't see this being practical within the equine industry just due to the amount that they feed. They feed upwards to 16 hours a day, so they can easily degrade a pasture pretty quickly. And then, so this is more oriented towards people that have cattle cow-calf operations. And even dairy too, since the nutritional requirement is so high, and given that our land base is so small in New Jersey, this is something that would be more of a nuanced niche kind of recommendation. The other con to adopting this is it's very management intensive. So you are moving your herd anywhere between every 2 to 3 days. And it's also something that you have to pay very close attention to your pasture, the growth of that forage. Another con would be the expense of the fencing materials. But one of the pros of this practice is that you're actually generating a lot of your forage on farm, and it's also it's being evenly grazed so that you can retain root growth and shoot growth at a greater capacity. The other thing I kind of wanted to touch on a little bit was the use of warm season grasses. Now, I feel this strategy can be implemented with both cool season and warm season grasses. Warm season grasses are a little difficult to seed due to their inconsistent size, and then their time to germination, and then when they're actually seasonally available. So in the beginning of the season, right about now, you're starting to see, and depending upon where you are in the state, you're starting to see some of your cool season grasses, like your fescues, you're starting to see those start to green up now. So that's a feed source that's going to be available to your livestock now. Whereas the warm season grasses, the temperatures have to warm before they're a viable forage for your livestock animals. And here's a schematic here. So this is a basic picture of rotational grazing, and these individual areas are what are called paddocks. One area is grazed, and it's grazed to the point about up to 3 to 4 inches in height, and then they are moved to the next paddock and the next paddock. It doesn't look as neat and clean as this usually, but it's an art and a science, and it's up to the manager to determine how the grass is growing, and it depends upon seasonal nature. So how warm the season is, how quickly your grass is growing, how much nutrition you have in your soils, as well as how much they're feeding, and then how much precipitation you've had for that season as well. Another practice that I am recommending, this is the umbrella term, agroforestry. There's a lot of categories that fit beneath that. That could be anywhere, anything from riparian buffers, forest farming, silvopasture, which is the integration of cattle into a wooded area, windbreaks and hedgerows, tiered cropping strategies. So you're, say, for instance, you want to do rows of hardwood materials intermixed with either, I would see that being more practical for small fruits, brambles and raspberries, and maybe some strawberries. But again, this is something that needs more research and time to look at the practicality within our state, as well as scalability. That's a major component to that. And is this economically viable? The next I want to talk about are just some general, these are not necessarily target recommendations. However, they are, I believe, practical recommendations to increase the adoption of some of these climate smart practices. First and foremost, really creating producer cooperatives. So where we're actually either exchanging equipment, especially if another farmer wants to try to use cover crops that hasn't before, as well as get some guidance from farmers that have implemented it. Another is increasing the availability of technical service providers. So that's because there needs to be a good bit of hand-holding for some of our producers in order to start to adopt some of these practices. They have a lot of things that are going on throughout the season, and they're managing so many different things that it's very difficult to just tell them to do it and then not give them any guidance. And then another thing too would be to expedite some of this funding when available to these producers so that they can kind of hit the ground running. The other is enhancing the productivity of soils. Now, I think we need to have a better understanding of what that entails. So with soil testing, and especially at when you're going into deeper columns of the soil where practical, of course, and then keeping in mind too that some of our sandy soils don't have the capacity to store carbon like some of our other more clayey, loamy soils. We also want to identify funding sources to facilitate the adoption of some of these climate smart practices. So particularly looking at reduced tillage. And so that's another umbrella term, and it can take many forms. It's also known as minimum tillage. Another way that you could implement reduced tillage on your farm is through strip tillage, mulch tillage. And really what that entails, doesn't say that you're reducing the amount of passes that you have in the field, but you're reducing the intensity of it. So you're allowing to have about 30 to 40% residue surface covering on your soils, and then you're doing more shallow passes. And there, so then with funding, try to make incentives available for farmers to want to adopt these practices, make it economically viable for them, because a lot is resting on even getting through the whole entire season. Not only do they have to manage their labor, their workforce, and what their inventories are, as well as sourcing buyers and communicating with their customers. But on top of that, they're dealing with Mother Nature. So that is something that we should really keep in mind, because if you all know from last year, we really had little to no rain during the season. So that has a major impact on their management decisions. So that's something that we should keep in mind. Another recommendation is arranging for insurance protection for farmers who can change their practices and benefit from that additional carbon sequestration. We kind of hinted a little bit about that with the carbon markets. However, I feel that there needs to be more specific data to our state, and how are these numbers being calculated. And our questions for you, what's missing in my draft targets? And then are there anything that doesn't belong within here? And any other recommendations that you have to provide would be very much appreciated. And thank you for your time.
Thanks, Rachel. So the agriculture list of targets is kind of unique compared to our other land types, because we're looking at changes that are largely, we're hoping to occur on private property that have the potential to impact livelihood of people. So this land type will really need a greater partnership with people in this industry, we realized that a lot of work would need to happen to be able to reach so many of these goals. But some of those policy recommendations could really help to usher those things along. It looks like we do have one question in the chat from Gina. She asked about the sources of biochar. So in your biochar slide, did you get into where that would come from, or was that kind of just for demonstration purposes?
That was a demonstration purpose. However, this is something that came up pretty recently. We're starting to work on that internally right now, but it's kind of unfortunate. There are a lot of people that are starting to implement the use of, and it's a recognized practice now as a carbon amendment with the NRCS, so you can get some cost share on that. But we don't have a locally produced commercial source within our state. A lot of the biochar that's actually being applied to the fields are those that are coming from out of state. And then there's also no permitting guidance for those that want to produce on farm. So that kind of being a bit of a gray area, it's almost a chicken or an egg scenario. And so that's something that we want to develop some guidance and work with DEP to figure out, potentially even a private a pilot program, something along those lines to see, because there's a lot of, like, anything can be turned into biochar. That's what's pretty interesting. There's a lot of farm wasted material slash piles. And what I had mentioned a little bit before with some of the ash trees and stuff, why not use that, what would be considered a trash resource, and make that something that could supply nutrient or be a nutrient hold for your crops.
Thanks, Rachel. It looks like Bob has a hand raised. Bob Talon, we're going to go ahead and give you the ability to turn on your microphone. You'll have to do that on your end as well.
Okay, did it come on?
It's on.
Okay. Yeah, my question is a question probably and a comment. I have to look at my township. I'm more concerned with my township, but I think it broadens the question overall of what you guys are talking about here. But I look at our township, Mansfield in Burlington County. We have approximately 2,000 acres of preserved farmland, and most of it is not irrigated. And when I've lived here a long time, and I've seen the farming practices. Most of the farming is corn, soybean rotation with some alfalfa, hay fields, and most of it is non-irrigated, and then a little bit on the composting. I had talked to folks from water allocation at DEP last spring, I believe it was, and they did say there's water allocation available for irrigation, but has the question come up in dry, how many acre feet is available if for most of these farms that haven't sought a permit to irrigate that would offset, drought season years and production of crop and help sequester carbon and have a secondary benefit of food security that isn't what we're talking about here. But I don't know how much potential's left in the groundwater we have. I know in some areas we're actually not in the best shape, but in other areas we have a little bit of surplus left. But I was wondering, is there a number available for, and is there a way of factoring in how much carbon offset would be done if we had a supplemental irrigation? I think most of our farms of that 2,000 acres, probably 1,500 acres of it is not irrigated. And I understand that the farms can put in for a permit to get an allocation. Most of them haven't. But would that help? Would that water be available? And the same for composting. Composting, if it doesn't have a water source, can take a long time, especially in a dry season year. So my main question is, in this equation that we're talking about, sequestering carbon and farming and use of agricultural fields, is water allocation being considered as one of the priorities?
Well, that's something that, so DEP is you guys handle the water allocation permits in conjunction with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. So those wells are metered, those that are utilizing irrigation. As far as looking at that as a carbon sequestration aspect, I had not really, water is life. So and all this nutrient exchange wouldn't occur if we don't have water. And to long and short of your question, I didn't really look into water allocation being a factor towards some of these strategies.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Bob, I think we kind of operated under the assumption that there's sufficient water for the practices that were recommended, but we totally understand what you're saying, that, you know, growth would increase with more water in certain situations. I'd imagine that's very site specific, but if you want, we can connect you with somebody in water allocation for more discussion after the call. I'll have your email from the registration. I can reach out to you.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it would be considered when we were thinking about each recommendation and the potential impacts of climate change on those recommendations in areas where there may be, you know, drier growing seasons and longer periods between precipitation. That would certainly be something that would be captured in the strategy.
And then to note as well, too, just when you're amending your soils with organic matter, you're actually increasing your available water storage capacity, as well as even doing diversified rotations. That better root growth designates greater water holding capacity really within the soils themselves. So that was part of what I was thinking about.
Great, thanks, Rachel. All right, Kristen has her hand up next. If you turn your mic on, Kristen, you should be able to speak now.
Yes, yeah, thanks. This is Kristen Meistrel with New Jersey Audubon. I've got 3 points, and maybe some of them are obvious, but the first is just making sure that all these recommendations are communicated and partnered with USDA programs, right? So making sure that that their financial assistance programs, whether that's through CREP or SAFE or EQIP, lines up with what you all are working on, and potentially using that to leverage each other to get the work done. The other point was, you know, this may be moving in this direction, but the amount of considering the amount of acres on wildlife management areas that may be under agricultural leases, and trying to, you know, make sure that all of those leases are required to use climate smart practices. I know that has started to happen a little bit in some areas, but that could be a really good place to start as well. And then also kind of considering areas within agricultural land that may not be very productive, whether it's always been limited on productivity or, you know, due to climate changes is no longer productive, starting to look at that and converting those to natural areas, whether it's grasslands, anything else. And then with that last point is to also consider, you know, especially if there are properties that are under farmland preservation or have some kind of deed restriction on them, that that may be an impediment to having some of that work done. So, you know, understanding that, you know, that some deeds restrict the land use and require that the farms continue to be in production, and that natural areas aren't necessarily considered that always. So there may need to be some amendments to deed restricted areas.
Yeah, so to answer your first point, almost everything that we do is in coordination with NRCS. Whether it be writing these conservation plans, we're very closely partnered with NRCS. To answer really, and I like your consideration with some of these ag leases. I think that's a great point, because that's our more of our public lands. We would have more control over that. Now and then the implications kind of with your third and fourth point, really, with some of these deed restricted areas that have to be in production in perpetuity. If we were to, for instance, if it's like a wooded wetland and it was originally modified agriculture, the implications for reversing that and bringing it back to a natural area could we're no longer able to produce on that anymore. So that's something, and especially if somebody's holding that land, it has to still maintain a semblance of value. So that's more of a, it's dicey. And there's a lot of different ways to look at that. But one of the strategies that we looked at, particularly with some of these conservation areas, was the agroforestry portion of it. So when I spoke about riparian zones, I didn't really speak too much about riparian zones, but sorry about that. And then some of our field hedgerows, those are things that I think we could really, and I would like to see more financial effort go to some of these areas. In my region, I'm mentioning ash trees a lot, but looking at some of these field hedgerows, these are some of these areas that are not capitalized on that really could use a lot of rejuvenation. So thank you for your question.
Great, thank you.
Heather, there's a couple comments and questions in the chat. Virginia Lamb says, define a definite need for less complicated pathways to more TSPs. As I understand it, now you must work for NRCS to get certified. Then next we have from Laura, can you explain why the different X's under 2030 and why there are different X's for 2030 and 2050? Are these anticipated short-term / long-term actions?
I'd have to get back to you on that just to double check on the second question. But the TSP is a USDA process. So that all gets, in order for you to be a technical service provider, you do need to go through NRCS in order to get that certification.
Rachel, I'm going to throw the slides up again real quick. I think once you're looking at them, that question will be clearer. But basically, Laura, I think you understood it correctly, that some of those actions are things that we would do initially by 2030, and then they're kind of done. And other ones would take longer to achieve. So we'd be looking at those in 2050. We'll just go through this at a whiplash pace here. And okay, so here's one example. I'm going to move to the next one.
And then to note too, with some of those X's, we don't really have any, it was difficult to develop a target on this when we don't have any preliminary data on who's already implementing this. So like I kind of mentioned previously in the other, in the beginning of my presentation, we don't know who, because there are farmers that are doing a lot of these things already, but we don't have the data. So that would absolutely play into some of this stuff too. So a lot of this is just developing some baselines, and particularly with the target, the policy recommendations, it's difficult to get a number value on that. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, Rachel. And on this slide here, you can see like the 2050 targets that aren't in motion by 2030 are a state-specific breeding initiative. That would be a pretty big lift to get that going. And then an entire new insurance process. So, you know, maybe understandable why those are a longer time horizon. All right, Mattia, where are we at in the chat? Who else is
All right, next we continue to lose farmland to development at a fast pace. Do the projections for carbon capture amounts adjust for the fact that we will have far less acreage in agriculture if we don't control the sprawl? Plus the sprawl increases carbon emissions. Like, yeah, does the sprawl increase carbon emissions?
I would say yes, sprawl does, because in creating impervious surface, you're not allowing soil, and soils become dirt once they are fully paved. A producer yesterday said something very interesting that really struck me. And once you allow a warehouse to be developed, that's the final crop. But what he meant by that is once it goes over to that, it gets reverted. It's very unlikely that it'll go back to agricultural land. So I totally agree in decreasing the sprawl. So some of our the state planning committee has put out some guidance on, and this is a really town by town issue as well. There needs to be ordinances in place that prohibit scaling up some of these developments. And I hope I answered some of. Is there another portion of the question if I missed that?
I think just that I can answer this part. So at this point, we haven't come up with projections for the amounts of carbon capture. There were too many different practices and different habitat types to be able to calculate that in the short amount of time that we had to develop the strategy. So for this first iteration, we're just identifying things that we think would have a major benefit in terms of carbon sequestration. Then the next phase would be trying to quantify that. Okay, next okay, we've got a hand up, Heather. Do you want to do that? And then I'll keep moving down the chat.
Sure thing. Caitlin or Peg, your mic should be available if you turn it on your end.
I can. Can you hear me?
Hi, Caitlin.
Hi, how's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
That also resonated with me that once you put up a warehouse, that's the last crop that will ever be on that land. So that was great. I do have a couple comments if you don't mind hearing me out.
Please, I would love to hear it.
Great presentation. Thank you for putting this together, everybody. When it comes to cover crops, I just want to make the point that cover crops and residue management really need to go hand in hand, and we need to be focusing on late termination of cover crops, not necessarily just getting more cover crops out on the ground. Some of our best and brightest farmers, they are doing cover crop and they are doing intensive vegetables, and even they recognize that their organic matter levels are completely stagnant because every time they till that ground, they're burning up all of the organic matter and the carbon in that soil. And a lot of our producers will put on cover crops and then terminate it very early in like March or April, but yet they're not actually planting in like May or June. And again, all that does is burn up all that carbon that we might have sequestered throughout the year, or I'm sorry, the couple months that cover crop was in the ground, at which point you really have a negative amount of carbon because you're doing more bad than good. So I think residue management and cover crops need to go hand in hand, or focus on late termination of cover crops. Risk Management Agency in New Jersey, you can plant green, and in order to keep your crop insurance, not have any issues with your crop insurance, you just need to terminate that cover crop before emergence. So that's, just keep that in mind. And then,
I was just going to say thank you for that, because I get a little freight train brain when I'm presenting, but I really appreciate that comment. Yeah, that's critical. Problem. It doesn't matter how many crops you're putting into the ground if you're not actually actively using that residue.
Yeah. And then silvopasture, I love it. We're trying to do more silvopasture stuff. I would focus, if you want to focus on silvopasture practices, trying, instead of putting animals into existing forest land, because for an appropriate silvopasture practice to actually work and sequester carbon, we actually need a pretty open canopy and that forage to be grown very well underneath the canopy. And a lot of times we actually take trees out to create that type of condition. So taking open fields and adding trees is, I think, where you'll get the biggest bang for your buck when it comes to silvopasture and carbon sequestration. And there's also certain kinds of trees that provide very valuable forage for animals, and also have been known to have higher levels of carbon sequestration than other ones as well. So you can look at, if you want to promote certain varieties of trees for benefit of forage production, well, tree forage production, I guess, not like typical grass production, but higher levels of carbon sequestration also. And then I also wanted to talking about, field borders and riparian areas. There is a practice called vegetative barriers that we haven't been using it too much in NRCS. It's pretty new, but I think that one we can get a lot of traction on. The primary practice is to stop erosion, but we all know that if you have erosion on your fields, your soils are going to be degraded and not be able to sequester carbon as well. But the vegetative barriers, I think we can get traction on because we can take a lot less ground out of production. It's just more attractive to producers to put in like 10 feet of permanent warm season type grasses, like a timber switchgrass or something like that, than to take out an entire area like 30 feet for a grassed waterway. So while we might not be putting as much into permanent vegetation, I think we'll be able to, throughout the state, put more smaller areas in collectively. So that might be a practice, very specific thing that you want to think about is that vegetative barriers practice. And then I did want to say, there's been talk about TSP stuff, you don't have to be a technical service provider for NRCS to write conservation plans. In other states, there's people that work for the Department of Ag that write conservation plans. Their conservation district staff write conservation plans. There's all sorts of folks that work for different agencies that write conservation plans. So keep that in mind too. It's not just the burden of NRCS and NRCS TSPs to write these plans. That can be expanded into a lot of different agencies.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I think that's all I got for you. Thank you.
I wish I touched a little bit more on some of what you were saying with even like the livestock fodder. I think that's very, very, that's an excellent point that you made, particularly some of the field rows and field edges and whatnot too. So I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Heather, I'm going to take a couple more comments from the chat and then we can jump over to the next person that has their hand up.
Sure.
So I'll
Before
just
we lose Caitlin, I just had one quick question
sorry.
for her. It's okay if she's off the line, we can always connect later. But a lot of what she explained was not just what these recommendations are, but how they're implemented. It sounds like maybe some kind of best management practices on these items would be useful, either for us to generate or to find existing documents like that. So I'm wondering if her agency might have those kind of practice plans already together.
They do.
Okay, sorry, Mattia. Who's up next then?
Okay, let's see. We have a couple comments. I'll just read them. I don't think we have to respond until we get to some questions, but if the goal is to increase compost applications, I hope we see better protections in place to avoid an increase in PFAS contamination via applied biosolids. The source and content of compost is an important consideration. The next one, we have some more information in the chat about the TPSs. Then got another one here. Let's see. On the partnership funding piece, and this came up on the Developed Lands meeting earlier this week, there are Department of Defense programs that could be helpful in terms of coordinating with the installation/ranges in New Jersey and securing additional funds to incentivize adoption of climate smart practices, deter conversion of working lands, etc. The recommendations there could be 1, engage New Jersey installations. Engage New Jersey installations and look at DoD's REPI program for funding. 2, pursue a Sentinel landscape designation in New Jersey, which brings coordination capacity across USDA, DoD, DOI, and DOI programming. Those are great suggestions. Thank you. All right, one more here, and then Heather will head back over to hands that are raised. We've got a plug for, it jumped on me. A plug for those interested in agriculture in northern New Jersey. There are some links. Okay. All right, so the next thing is that Amy Henson wants to comment. She's on the phone, the phone number. Is there a way for people on the phone to be unmuted?
Is that the 732 number?
Hold on, let me go back to the chat. Yes, 732-356.
Yes. I did say allow mic, but I'm not sure how we'll just see if they're able to speak now.
If not, Amy, if you can't get through and you can hear us, feel free to submit comments in the web form. We'll be taking all of those, comments, suggestions, questions as well.
Okay, after Amy then is Laura. You should be able to turn your mic on now.
Hi, this is Laura Tesseri, Director of North Jersey RCND. Thank you for the presentation and the targets. So many of them are good ones and ones that would really make a difference. So we're an agricultural nonprofit, and thank you for letting me shamelessly drop those couple of links. They're just new, and we're trying to get the word out about those programs. And one of the things that I find really interesting is a lot of the good water quality work that we work with farmers, like go out and provide technical assistance and additional cost share, also translate into climate smart benefits. And so being able to, if we could quantify those, how could we quantify those, all speak the same language, to make sure that we're reporting on them? I think that's important, because that one program is funded by multiple partners that includes, DEP 319 funds, Department of Ag, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So, and just thinking through and going forward, how can we keep programs like this, or how can we grow those that are giving, technical service to farmers, working with farmers, and have educated ag service professionals? How can we grow that network? Because there's more work out there than, any one agency can do. And so, NRCS does great work in the Department of Ag. There's a bunch of nonprofits, Grow Rutgers Cooperative Extension, the soil conservation districts. I think if we could all partner together and keep this work going, we really can make great strides, because a lot of the farmers out there, some of them are implementing this on their own because they see that it makes economic sense to them. Others need a lot of hand-holding. And so there's a range of different types of farmers, and also what sort of resources they have access to. And they're really, I find that we really fill a niche being able to help connect some of those farmers to then what the other larger resources are that are out there. So I just wanted to say I'm thankful to see this. We'll think through and give some more comments, but just wanted to comment verbally. Thank you.
Thank you.
It looks like the caller on the 732 number may have an active mic now. If you're able to chime in, go right ahead.
Great. Hi, this is Amy Hansen, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. I am happy to hear the practices and suggestions you've been laying out as far as agroforestry and using riparian areas and keeping the residue on the land. And there's some really great suggestions and ideas, and we will provide more in writing. But I wanted to mention, you mentioned the problem with impervious surfaces creating more carbon emissions, and so we want to prevent the conversion of agricultural lands and soils to non-ag uses and impervious surfaces by preserving more farmland. But the preservation program has still not enacted soil protection standards or limits to what you can build on preserved farms. And so we really urge the Department of Agriculture to enact strong soil protection standards, which will help sequester carbon and protect natural resources. We also would urge that solar development on prime soils not be allowed. And as was mentioned, New Jersey can capitalize on significant federal funding from the Federal Inflation Reduction Act to support climate-friendly agriculture, and we can provide more information on that if needed. We're hoping too that New Jersey will support the increase of organic farming across the state or non-synthetic chemical farming, because the use of some synthetic chemicals has been shown to increase carbon emissions, and so we hope that more organic will be supported, and certainly the public's in favor, as the income from organic sector has been rising every single year. The Fish and Wildlife Department is doing some good work with a goal of 500 acres of wildlife management areas to become organically farmed, and specifically with grains, perennial grains that will not use irrigation will not need irrigation or fencing. So we're hoping that that will expand across the state and provide many benefits, including reaching greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So as I said, we will provide more specific comments, but thank you so much.
You're welcome. To your point too, SADC has been working and continues to work on the soil protection standards. So that's something that they have to vet and make sure that their constituents and those that the other parties that are interested can agree to these standards. This wasn't on the original deed of easement when farmland preservation first got started. Then also to your point with the solar, it's not permitted on prime agricultural soils, those of which that are located within agricultural development areas. And I would love to see more perennial grains as being implemented within production. But with anything, there has to be a market for it and an economic component to implementing these practices. So I thank you for your comments.
I just wanted to add that River Valley Community Grains they've put up a mill to process the grains and have some guarantees for farmers who are growing those grains in the state. So that's really exciting, and they're willing to help market. So thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. They're doing winter wheat. So I know some of them pretty well. They're also going to be putting up a permanent mill closer to Blairstown area. And again, there's a learning curve with doing grain. There's some fungal issues. That's why when you look into the Midwest, they don't have the humidity that our state actually has. So it's difficult to do, and then also land capacity as well. It's difficult to do small grains such as that on a large scale.
Okay, we have one more comment in the chat about the need to make sure that we have enough water for crop production, especially during the dry seasons. And we will definitely take that into consideration in the targets and in our description of the targets. So thank you for that comment. And that's it from the chat.
I'm going to leave this open for a few more minutes because I find that as folks have time to digest, they come up with a little more input. But in case anybody needs to get going sooner than that, our last stakeholder meeting is going to be this Tuesday, and that will be covering forests. We have mentioned the comment form on our website. We're looking for any comments on these targets to be submitted by April 14th. And we do anticipate this being the only comment period on the strategy. So please review it, get involved now. We are targeting release of that final strategy late in the third quarter of this year. And I will show you this link on all of the remaining slides. You will have it burned into your brain. So if you haven't had a chance yet to look at our full list of targets for all of the land types, you go to the link at the bottom of the slide here, and you can see the third item there in the resources is the draft list of targets. Also conveniently in these presentations, we have copied every single target and dropped it into the slides. So if you've been coming to the talks, you've heard all about these. And if you want to submit comments, under the green buttons here is our comment form, and it will drop down and it will look like this. So you can put in, it's okay if you have comments on several land types, on several topics. We're not picky about how you get those in. Just make sure they come in before April 14th. And I see something in the chat from Tom about using our federal representative, Senator Bob Melendez, as a resource. That's a great suggestion. Thank you. So we'll stay on here just a few more minutes. But we've got a lot of good input. We really appreciate everybody's time And we're going to review the list that was here today. We want to make sure that this information is getting out to farmers as well. So if anybody on the line is a farmer yourself, we'd love to hear from you. It's important that we get buy-in from the people who this impacts the most. All right, we have a raised hand. Let me go ahead and allow your mic.
Hi there, it's Amy once again. Can you hear me?
Amy? Yes, how are you?
Hi, great, thank you. I just wanted to mention that my husband and I are farmers, organic fruit and vegetable farmers in Hunterdon County too. So I am speaking on behalf of my husband and myself. And when I talk about a preserve farm and impervious cover limits, well, we have limited impervious cover on our farm, and we just really support soil health and the water quality that comes from open lands and organic. Thank you.
Thank you.
And it looks like we have another one here. Christina's hand is raised, and you should be able to speak now.
Thank you. Yes, Christina Krobakova, 360 Earthworks. First, I just want to thank you because I can't believe how comprehensive this strategic plan is. In looking at it from a big planning view, I appreciate all the work that's gone into it and for making this stakeholder meeting possible, because I am a land care consultant in couple counties where there is significant interest in transitioning with cover crops, but as you said, the nuances of them are so site specific with the microclimate and all the particular history of disturbance in the region. And one thing that in working with a young farmer through the RC&D program, which is great to try to get a young farmer to buy in, but he was very quickly discouraged because he was one of the few people that was hoping to work with that program, not using herbicides. And so, of course, younger farmers learning and hear from seasoned farmers, you're never going to be able to do that without herbicide applications. Never going to be able to figure that out. And, so it's just that technical support. We're really working with private landowners and with other land care consultants to see how can we create a consortium of people to support all these hardworking people in NRCS, RC&D, and that are working out in the field, and maybe providing the encouragement and support to connect those people with the right people that know how to persevere through some of the initial challenges with cover cropping, because they'll want to revert back to a conventional practice of termination through herbicide application. So just to note that it's nuanced, but just to be a little bit more revealing about how quickly it can revert back to a conventional practice. Here you're trying to sequester carbon, so you're like, okay, cover crop the land, but then you're terminating the cover crop with herbicide, and so that kind of is a paradox of sorts. So just maybe a little more information about those are for detail-oriented people that have the innate passion to really pursue that kind of detail specific to that land. Because you don't want to set them up for failure if it's got a long history of disturbance and invasives and everything else under the sun. Having really good quality soil tests, which is what came out of RC&D, that cache soil test of structure, biology, and chemistry working together is really impactful to understanding the complexity of soil health, and then it empowers the individual to really dial in the details around cover crops, if that makes any sense.
No, I appreciate your comments too, and especially if you're trying to manage terminating your cover crops organically. I mean, I've had personal experience using like a roller crimper. This is my college days, so this is a little while ago. but it's very difficult to control weeds. And then especially if you're in a commercialized scenario where you're cultivating grain, you're not going to get the same yields that you're going to be getting if you were to conventional. So that the trade-off to some of that. And it does take, with implementing cover crops, it does take upwards 2 to 3 years to really see an improvement within your soils. So that's really why I wanted to emphasize even some of these like grower producer cooperatives, because they can share information. And I think that would be very, very advantageous if we had more of that.
Yes,
thank you so much for your comment.
Into that. So thank you. We're going to work on connecting people to that. So there is a supply chain and there's that support system, specifically patrons of farming that can maybe front end some of that losses. We've worked with a couple properties that are absolutely willing to cost share or even provide cover the loss that the farmer might take. So we have, some prototypes or proofs of concept of how that could work. So just very, very happy to be watching all the progress you've been making, and I'll be in the wings, just connected with really a lot of good people on this call. So thank you again.
Thank you. I'll probably reach out to you.
Thank you.
Okay, a few more questions in the chat. The first one, do you anticipate more incentives will become available through the state?
The short answer is we hope so. I don't know that all of those details are worked out. Rachel, does that sound like we're on the right track? We realize that for people to adopt these risky practices that are different from what they've always done, they need a reason to do it. So Rachel, I'll let you take over from there.
No, and I'm going to mirror what you just said, Heather, because it's a financial, farming is just a risk in general. And really what it comes down to is we're actually working on it internally to allow different types of cross share programming to be available to producers, and then working with our partners at NRCS and then even our nonprofit partners too. But anywhere where we can provide some financial assistance, that's something that's very important on our end of it too, because we don't want to force anything, and we don't want to say you need to do this and then not give you the tools to do so.
Okay, next we have a recommendation that it's kind of in the form of a question. Can the report make a general recommendation that actively farmed lands and forests be exempt from builders' remedy lawsuits, which is not something I'm familiar with, which currently result in 85% market rate housing and only 15% affordable housing?
I can't answer that question because I'm not familiar with that either.
Okay, well, we will look it up and definitely
yeah.
consider it. Yeah.
Yeah, please send that question along too, because I would like to and contact.
Yeah. Okay, so then Dennis follows up to say these suits are filed by large corporations under the guise of affordable housing, but in fact sprawl 85% higher end housing. So I guess it's the conversion of farmland to housing.
With the affordable housing requirement. Yeah, that's more of a DCA question. Division of Community Affairs.
All right, let's see. All right. And then from Tom Gilbert, we have, what do we know about the status of IRA funding for climate-friendly ag practices? That seems to be the best way to tap into funding. Is someone from DEP, DAG tracking this?
Yes, we are working on that. That's going to be our, and I thank you for bringing that up. But that is going to be what we're looking at for a major source of funding for these practices.
Okay, and then we've got a comment, excellent to hear about possible incentives. We found risk payments important to our farmers enrolled in our farm research trial on spring management of cover crops. And Heather, that's the end of the questions and comments in the chat at this point.
Great. The one from Ashley Kerr offering to distribute the information in the Farm Bureau newsletter would be amazing. Ashley, I can send you an email after the call, and I'll list out just the ag targets, you know, what input we're looking for, how people can give us that, and then maybe you can just plug that right into the newsletter. So this is our third call, and I just want to say we've had really great audiences, you know, highly educated people working and living in New Jersey that have been adding a lot of value to this. You know, it'll be so much stronger for it, and it gets us really excited to know that people are interested in these kinds of projects and in the outcome that we're all working towards. I think we've probably reached the end of the talk today. If you would like to come back for the forestry session, that is on Tuesday at 2 o'clock. It'll be the same kind of setup. And thanks for spending your valuable time with us. We really appreciate all of the input on the strategy and hope everyone has a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.